Operation Neptune was the naval assault leading to the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, that marked the beginning of Operation Overlord and the battle for Normandy. Although the public perception is that Operation Overlord was a tremendous victory for the Allies, this was not achieved without difficulties. In his report, Admiral Ramsey says, during the first few weeks of the operation, frequent representations were made by your staff and those of your Army Group commanders whenever the build-up appeared to fall any distance short of the plan. The non-return of shipping had an immediate impact on the outloading ports in the United Kingdom. Its worst effect was felt in Southampton, where backlogs of both men and supplies immediately began to form. The personnel, like the shipment of supplies, was pre-scheduled, and the entire mounting process was already in full swing when D-Day was postponed 24 hours. As men continued to pour into the ports, even though embarkations had halted, the ports quickly became clogged. It soon had its repercussions farther back along the lines of movement. Before long, camps were so overcrowded that the original craft load basis of marshalling lost all meaning, and all flexibility of control temporarily disappeared. Each day's craft assignment continued to differ, both in quantity and in type, from the planned movement. The confusion reached its height about the 12th of June, when units became so badly scrambled that troops could not be identified and sorted into craft loads at all. The burden of the outloading sectors became so heavy at this time that stowage and loading plans made on the basis of expected movements simply had to be abandoned, and the US Zone Chairman, Colonel Stevens, on his own authority, diverted vessels to the British sector in order to avoid wasting precious shipping which otherwise would have remained idle. Lack of advance information about actual craft availability added to the difficulties, and loading was either hastily worked out on paper within a few hours' notice or was improvised on the ground. Some units were lost for several weeks. The example of Major General Leonard T. Guerrero, the 5th Corps commander, goes to show the odds stacked against administrative control when he personally returned to the United Kingdom to locate a unit which the southern base section insisted was shipped to the continent, to find that it had not even moved out of its assembly area. The Overlord planners had foreseen the need for exercising detailed control over the mounting process, and it was precisely for this purpose that they had established BUCO in both US and British sectors. In practice, however, in the American sector, the movement control machinery did not operate as intended. The logjam was finally to end by funneling troops into the ports and onto ships and craft as fast as possible and without regard to craft loading plans. An operational rather than an administrative problem which bore directly on the tactical situation on the beachhead was the shortage of ships and vessels to be loaded in the UK. Admiral Ramsey in his report says the programme did fall behind. The immediate cause of this shortage was the failure of ships to return from the far shore for the planned shuttle service. Shipping simply did not complete the round trip to the beaches. This failure is partly attributable to discharge difficulties on the far shore and to a wasteful use of craft. The failure to receive ships' manifests at the beaches contributed to the tie-up of shipping. Vessels were not always unloaded as they arrived, and they were often subjected to a selective discharge to obtain certain urgently needed supplies. A number of ammunition ships were only partially unloaded in the search for comparatively small quantities of particular types of shells, and then remained idle off the Normandy coast. One example was the search for 81mm mortar shells, which were urgently required in the Normandy hedgerow fighting, when troops were forced to conduct a ship-by-ship search to find the desired items. Late in June, after hearing many complaints on the subject of manifests, General Eisenhower became impatient with the poor performance and promised that heads would roll if no improvement was shown. Troops and vehicles went ashore via two methods. Under the first, landing craft, except LSTs, landing ship tanks, would beach on a falling tide, discharge after the water had receded, and then wait to be refloated on the next tide. Vehicles and men could thus go off the ramps onto a dry beach instead of wading through several feet of water. Only the smaller craft used this procedure. LSTs were unloaded onto ferry craft and ducks. However, it became evident when unloadings fell behind that the process had to be speeded up. One solution was to beach LSTs and dry them out, but naval authorities did not favour this procedure because it was feared, unlike the Mediterranean campaign, that they might break their backs if dried out on the Normandy beaches. However, with the loss of scores of smaller craft in the assault, it was decided to take the risk, and beginning on D+2, LSTs were dried out regularly, and the beaching and drying out technique was an important factor in the accelerated build-up of troops and vehicles. The storm had already aggravated the shipping position by its destruction of LCTs, and it was especially important that the maximum number of shallow draft coaster type vessels be retained in the Channel shuttle service to permit the fullest utilisation of the beaches and small ports. Before the end of June thereafter, headquarters took steps to end the embarrassment in shipping. Immediately after the storm, with the US vehicle build-up about 35,000 in arrears, General Eisenhower applied to Washington and succeeded in getting additional allocations. In September, when the great bulk of troops scheduled for the movement from the United Kingdom to the continent had been outloaded, BUCO ceased to function and its responsibilities turned over to the United Kingdom Base Section. It was expected that troops would move from the United States directly to the continent after September, but inadequate port and staging facilities on the far shore led to a continuation of important outloading activities from the United Kingdom. Large troop ships, including the Queen's, the Mauretania and the Aquitania, brought US troops into the Clyde and Mersey ports for immediate transshipment to the continent. These troops were then moved by train to Southampton and its subports in the Portland-Weymouth area, which at that time was handling all cross-channel troop shipments. With the exception of periods of adverse weather conditions, troops were disembarked at the Clyde and Mersey areas and re-embarked at Southampton and Portland within 18 hours. The view of Admiral Ramsay Hinner's report was that the build-up plan should be an optimum plan at which we should aim, but that its attainment was most improbable, if only by reason of the naval difficulties inherent in the continuous turnaround of such a large volume of shipping. Eventually, 39 Allied divisions would be committed to the Battle of Normandy. 22 US and 12 British, 3 Canadian, 1 Polish and 1 French, totaling over 1 million troops.